morning everyone and welcome to part 1 of DX Hotels. I must say the interest for this presentation has been outstanding and we've got people from all over the world here today. So good morning, good afternoon or good evening wherever you may be. There's a lot of content to cover both today and tomorrow, so let's jump straight in and get started. First thing I want to do is set some expectations early. Now what you're not going to see is me typing line after line of code. Not only would that be boring, but in places quite humorous as I'm not the world's best typist. But what you are going to see is me building DX Hotels from scratch. I'm going to use CodeRush to insert blocks of code along the way, and I will explain exactly what's happening. So where applicable, you'll be able to use those snippets or ideas in your next application. I am going to explain why we feel certain controls are better suited to others. And I'll point out controls that can do similar things. And I'll certainly be highlighting some tips and tricks along the way, particularly with client-side events and CSS. Today we're going to run through the DX Hotels live pages, talk about design, CSS, assets and scripts. Then we'll create the application. We'll start with the master page, put some user controls on there and explain the importance of those, and then start to build out the landing page. Let's jump over now and have a look at what DX Hotels looks like in flesh. When you first land on the page, it's crisp, it's clean, it has a really nice style and feel to it. We can see straight away that there's some call to actions. We have a login button, which is going to invoke the pop-up control panel. Using the same control, but in a slightly different way, we've got the Contact Us button, which displays just some basic information on how you can get in touch with us here at DevExpress. You've got the Search Panel control, which features the combo box and some predefined columns. This is data bound to give you that key information. We then have things such as the Date Edit controls, which when they pop up, presents a really nice rich feel to the user. You'll also notice that we've blocked things like previous dates out. Now I'm going to show you how easy it is to achieve this type of effect. We've got some basic client-side business logic that if I increase the number of adults, the number of rooms will change also. Likewise, if I have a set number of adults, I can only have a maximum number of children. So I'll be showing you how you can achieve this in your application. We have the widget controls. We've implemented drag and drop zones so that they can only be placed where you want. If I close all of these panels, you'll actually see that the page reclaims the space, providing you to use a pop-up style or just some information banner. And then at the bottom of the page here, we've got our special offers, which is presented using the gallery control. We use some CSS overrides to get this hotel information in this top right hand corner. So I'll be showing you how that was done as well. Now the page itself is based around a master page concept. We have this beautiful logo sitting at the top and the banner control or the footer on every page as well. Now I'm not going to step through every page in DX Hotels right now. Instead we'll visit those pages as we start building them out. As with any good website or even application, it all begins with a good solid design. Our team sat around and talked about what would be a nice application to build out. Sometimes this process can be done with napkins, pieces of paper, but ultimately the designers go away and come back with a finished product. If you're using packages such as Photoshop, it makes it really easy as a developer to start working through those processes. So in this instance, I was able to export some of the assets from the Photoshop file. And I can also export some CSS and other things. And that can go a long way into helping. See, when it comes to laying out your website, the CSS is a huge part of getting that look and feel how you want. And so there's a lot of different tips and tricks that you can work with at that point. Although I'm going to show you some controls, like the ASPX form layout control, that can save you a ton of time when it comes to laying the page out. As I mentioned, I was able to export a number of assets straight from Photoshop, and I've got these sitting inside a couple of folders, in particular one master folder called Content. And I'm going to be dragging that into our application as we start. So let's jump straight over to Visual Studio and start building the application. So we're starting inside Visual Studio with a completely blank canvas. I'm going to choose File, New, and Website. At this point, I want to choose the DevExpress template gallery. I'm using C# as the language. I want to point out that the DX Hotels application actually ships with the version 14.2 installer. And with that, you have the source code for both C# and VB. From the template gallery wizard, I'm going to choose an empty website. Give a name of DX Hotels and click Create Project. What Visual Studio is going to give me is a template or boilerplate solution. Inside there, and particularly the web.config file, is going to have a reference to all of the DX libraries that I want to use. I'm going to make some changes to that, and then I'm going to start out by importing some other files. While we wait for Visual Studio, let's take a look at that contents folder. I've got this little file called DX Helpers, and inside content we can see that I've got my images, which is quite literally just full of picture files that I want to use inside DX Hotels. Now, when we build our applications as demos, we've got to make certain design considerations. For example, there's no implementation of the login screen using the identity network. And the reason for that is to keep the demos simple and concise. I did, however, do a couple of presentations last year on how you could secure your websites, and they're available on our YouTube channel. Visual Studio is ready for me now. First thing I want to do is drag that content folder into the application. If I expand the content folder, we'll see that I've got a couple of other little files. The jQuery file, a scripts.js file, which contains some helper methods that we're going to use. I'll make mention of these as and when we get to each part of the program, but effectively you can see things like callbacks and being able to expand or collapse controls at a client side. The first one that we'll be looking at is the close widget control, which is used for that widget panel coupon style on the front landing page. I also want to make mention at the moment that Mr. Julian Bucknell will be doing a JavaScript webinar in the next couple of weeks, because when we work through some of these things, he said, Paul, I really think there's a better way we can do some of that JavaScript. And so he's going to use this example and pull it apart and show you some really cool best practices when it comes to JavaScript. So I recommend that you head over to the webinar page and register for that one too. The next file is the styles.css. Now the CSS or cascading style sheet file is a really useful way to control or to dress up your elements. Effectively, you're setting the style properties for different class names. So we take, for example, the orange button. We can see that we're setting the background color, the border, float, and margin. You'll notice as well that I have these pretty little colors inside Visual Studio, and that's all part of the CodeRush plugin. Makes it real easy for selecting the different color brushes. Of course, the beauty here is that inside my HTML or my markup, I can actually reference the orange button class name, and it will apply those attributes to the control. So we're going to see a lot of that as we go through. In order to get started, I now need to add some data into here. So I'm going to drag the hotel booking database file into the app data folder. And then I need to create an app code folder. So I'm going to choose right-click, add, ASP.NET folder, and app code. I've got the entity framework layout file sitting here. So again, I will just click, highlight, and drag those into the app code folder. This is quite literally just an entity framework model that's been built from the hotel booking data file. When I open this, we're going to see all the different relationships of the tables. I'll just change the zoom style to say 75%, and you can see we've got table names such as hotel, which is linked off to rooms, hotel features, etc. So we tried to build a real world table database scenario so that you can see exactly how it would map. Now, Entity Framework does a great job of building all the classes behind the scene, but in this case, we want to also expand that, and we're going to create an expansion class. But I'm skipping ahead a little bit here. What I want to do to start with is actually come into my web.config and make a couple of minor changes. First thing is to remove the default connection string and implement my own. Now all I've done is said I want a connection string called hotel booking, that my data source is going to be a local instance of SQL Express. At that point, I want to attach the hotel booking MDF file, and I'm using integrated security. If the name of your SQL Express or SQL Server is something different, simply replace this section with a valid data. Next thing I want to do as I scroll down through here is set the culture. This is useful when your website's formatting currency values or date values. I'm going to select English US for culture and UI culture. Inside the pages section, I want to add a namespace. I'm going to add a new namespace which is called hotel booking. And then finally in this section, I want to bring in a reference to the reporting namespace. This is going to be used in part 2 when I build the report file out. And then the very last thing to do is to actually update the theme, because the DX Hotels application is built around Metropolis. So come down to the DevExpress section, find themes, and then update that to Metropolis. I'm going to save those changes and close web.config. Before we can start building the master page, I want to build out that extension file for the database itself. We can do this by right-clicking on App Code, Add, Class, and I'll call it Hotel Booking Extend. Because it's a helper class, I'm going to delete what's in there to start with, create a new namespace, and call it Hotel Booking. This first entry is really just a helper property, and it's to do with the fact that our applications can run across multiple data sources. If you are following along, you need it right now, but it's not something you'd expect to see in your own application. I'm going to resolve some namespaces. And then I can come down to start building out the bits that are important. As I mentioned before, the Entity Framework creates these entities or classes behind the scenes, but there's some things that I want to do that's a little bit different. So I'm going to start by using CodeRush to expand some code blocks, and then step through exactly what's going on here. We're creating this public partial class called City, and inside City we've got a property called DisplayName. Quite literally, all DisplayName is doing is checking if the state province, which is a property of City, is empty. If it is, it's going to return just city name and country. If it's not empty, it's going to return city name, state, province, and then country. So it's just a wrapper around, or a nice way to present some data back to the user. We've then got some other things, such as an override on the hotel class, looking for the cheapest hotel. And it's doing inline lambdas to say, okay, let's see return the cheapest price across that hotel range. We've got things like URLs, helpers for URLs, returning fixed strings with the image and in our case just making sure that any reference to PNG is set back to JPEG. I'm not going to advocate that some of these things are best practices. In some cases, we've done things to keep it nice and simple to implement that use. I'm going to repeat that process for a few more elements. So HBE2, HBE3, and HBE4. Again, all we've done as I scroll through here is to add in partial classes, setting up some helpers, start price, end price, more formatting returns, making sure that the rating is an integer. On top of these extensions, I also need to create another class called data provider. This is something that is going to be used throughout all of the different pages. So we'll add a new class. This time call it data provider. Get rid of the constructor and start building this out. The red squiggles tell me that I need to resolve a namespace. So we'll import that. Then we have a couple of other elements in here. The first few items get used with the master page or with the extension classes. Between now and the next session, we'll bring some extra properties and functions in. We're now ready to build the master page. Right-clicking on the project, I'm going to add new item. At this point, I'm still in C#, but I'm going to use the search feature. And as I type master, we're going to see that I get the master page option. Making sure that I stay with C#, I'm going to call this site.master. Starting with the master page, I'll set the title to DX Hotels Demo. I'm going to come through and I want to drag in these files as inclusions. So just dragging styles.css up into the head section. I'm going to drag jQuery, and then finally I'll drag our scripts.js file. We're not going to be using any placeholders in the header. We'll ignore that. And then we're ready to start looking at the body. What I want to do is make sure that my master page by default implements a class or a CSS style. So here I'm going to set the class to page. When the page gets constructed or built, this information here is going to be replaced with the details of the inner page or the child page. So we have our div, we've got our placeholder, and thinking back to our initial layout, I actually want to create a header control and a footer control here. To do that, we'll add a new folder and call it user controls. To build a user control, I'm going to right click, add new item. Again, from the list box, I'm going to type the word user, and we can see that I've got the web user control as an option. The first one I want to build is going to be the header control. Whilst the file has an extension of .ascx, it is in fact just a markup file. We'll start out with a header control by adding a couple of divs in. The first one we're going to actually call header. So this is pointing back to that CSS file and going to set the attributes of header. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Come to my CSS file and look for the word header, and quite literally it's simply setting the width to 100%. Next I'm going to do another div which is going to represent where the position of the column is, or a content column. So content column, and then next inside here I want to actually have a place to hold my logo. Let's have a look at inside the style sheet what the settings for logo are. And we can see that logo actually has a float left and a margin of -25. So depending on whether it was using the header class, so here it's implementing that cascading style sheet of header and then logo. Switch back to our header control. Thinking back to what the page looks like, we've got this image here, we've got some buttons on the right hand side. So that's what we're trying to actually build. Dealing with the logo, I want to add in a hyperlink control. Now, obviously I could just use a label, or I could use an image control, or just a straight IMG if I wanted just HTML. But we want to showcase some of the really cool things that we do here at DevExpress. So I'm going to look for ASPX Hyper, and we've got the ASPX Hyperlink. I'm going to drag that in. First thing to do is change the name to HL Logo. And there are no text properties that I want to use, so I'm going to get rid of the text property altogether. Setting the navigate URL, whilst the page doesn't exist yet, I'm going to want this to point to our default.aspx. And then the second thing I want to do is specify the image URL. I'm going to use the picker this time and select from our content folder. Inside images, I want the header.png. If I switch to our design mode for a second, we're going to see now that I've got that nice control sitting there. It implements the look and feel of an image, yet I've got the navigate URL built in. So I don't actually have to write any code for href. And in fact, if I'd have used a designer, I wouldn't have had to type anything whatsoever. Next, we want to implement a div tag that's going to be looking after our buttons. So the class name is buttons. Coming back over to my toolbox, I can look for an ASPX button control. And by just bringing that in, we can see, let's remove our Solution Explorer, we've got a button. We're going to give it an ID of contact. It's a server-side control. And the text, we want to say contact us. Now there's a few extra properties that I want to set inside here. So I'm going to invoke a little helper. And all that's happening here, we're setting the property for auto post back to false. Got the font size of 14, a height and width property. And then it's setting the CSS class to orange button, which if we think back to our styles.css, let's look for orange button. And it's setting the background color, the foreground color, border, float, and margin. Having the CSS separated into classes like that makes it so much easier for reusing the styles themselves. Now I actually have another button that I want to implement as well. So this time I'm going to bring the button in all as one go. We've got the ID of login, text of login, again auto post back as false, client instance name, height, width, font, and class. You'll also notice that there's some client-side events being fired called show login panel. So we're going to need to add that code in a minute as well. Once we've finished the button, next thing we need to do is create a new div and call the class name clear. That's just going to remove any of the floats and things that are in place. Now this header control also has a couple of pop-up controls that it's responsible for. This first pop-up control is to do with our simulated login window. We can see that it has an ID name of login control. It has a client instance name of PC login. The control itself is being centered on the window horizontally and vertically. We're hiding the header and we're setting the width to a fixed width. There's also a couple of other properties such as modal, and you're going to get that effect if we switch to the main control and have a look. When we click login, it grays out the rest of the form to make it look as if it is a modal dialog that you'd typically see in a desktop application. Inside the pop-up control, we've got this pop-up collection, which is where we can actually specify the information that we want to show. I'm going to expand this and we're going to have a look at how we created that pop-up. We're separating the form into two elements, the form layout and then the buttons along the bottom. Let's expand this form layout. We're going to see the first use of one of the most powerful controls, or certainly the widest used control inside this presentation, and that's the ASPX form layout control. What I'm going to do is actually invoke the designer to show you. There's all those times that we have to create some kind of basic content with text boxes, labels, or other ancillary controls. And the ASPX form layout control simplifies that remarkably. Here we can see that we've got the control with 4 text boxes. Now the layout control itself is going to take care of all of the positioning. In fact, the last item is a capture, not the text box control. The beauty here is that you can have nested controls and you can add any type of control that you can imagine. So the support, you can have tabbed groups. It is such a powerful way of laying out visually what you want to see without you having to try and get in there and work through the CSS or other things. Just a quick cursory glance down the property list and you'll see how flexible this particular control is. You can be binding your data to the elements as you'd expect, but you can also specify how many columns wide, if there's a particular height that you want to go. You've got helper text, you've got the validation control. So it's really a neat way of building out those basic forms. And in fact, if I switch over to the design view again, we'll see straight away how it's going to look. And we've got the text controls, the capture control, all nicely spaced. I didn't have to sit there working through all of the CSS to do that. The buttons themselves, let's expand HC6 and see what happens. Again, we're implementing 2 ASPX button controls. The first one is saying, yes, I'm quite happy to go back to the server for my code to be executed. And that's going to implement this button login now event. Other than that, we're simply setting some basic properties. Now the button cancel is a client-side control, or we're invoking it from the client side. And it's going to call this function called hide login panel. Let's create that little bit of JavaScript. So I'm going to come to the top of the file and create a script element. Again, when Julian presents his webinar, you're going to see that in the latest specifications, you don't even need to specify what type of code you are executing. I'm going to create a new function, and it's going to be called hide login panel. It's going to take a sender and an event argument. And the code inside is simply going to say PC login, which is the local or the client instance name of our pop-up control, .hide. Now there's one small annoyance with the IntelliSense, is it sometimes thinks it knows better than you. And then the second function that we saw we created was the show login panel. So function show login panel. It takes a sender and event args. And this time, we're simply going to say PC login. You've guessed it, show. Save those changes. Let's do a build, make sure everything's happy. And of course, it's reminding me that I need to add some code behind into my header control. So the last step for this is to invoke the code editor. And then we need to add our method in here. We'll just expand the template HC8. And we've got a click event, which is going to check whether the capture control is valid, and if so, stop it from showing up on the page load. So simulating a nice login. Let's try a build again. I'm going to close some of these windows to clean some space, and then we need to add the footer control. Now the footer control is really quite simple. It has some text and some hyperlinks, and that's about it. You'll notice Visual Studio, after you've added a control for the first time, will give you most recently used entries here. So I'm just going to choose Web User Control from this subcontext menu. It's going to be called the footer control. And I'm going to paste everything in together. As we did with the original control, we've implemented a class specifically for footer. We've got this columns, content column, setting a right border, and then just some text elements into there, implementing href back to our websites. Nice and straightforward. At the bottom here, we've got another logo, using that logo class with a hyperlink control, this time using a different image, and this time driving back to our main corporate site. If I do a build, we're going to see everything. And of course, now we've got the master page, but we don't have a default page that we can build out. Right click, add, and this time we want to add a web page. But we've got to be careful, because when we add the web page, we need to make sure that we're going to be adding with a master page. I'm going to choose C# web form. It's already named default.aspx, but in the bottom right hand side we can see this select master page option. It's important that that is selected. I'm going to choose add, choose my site master. I only have the one in this project, and click OK. I don't need this top or head content because we're not interacting with the master page header section. So I'm going to delete that. We're now ready to start building out the basics of that details page. Working inside this contents area, I'm going to expand some templates. So D1, we can see that I have a placeholder here, which we're going to be populating in part 2, where we build the search panel user control. We've got this div tag, which is holding our booking title. Continuing to just expand this out. We're now at the widgets area. To implement the widgets, which can be used in such a variety of ways. For example, you can have widgets that you can drag and drop anywhere on this page. Or in our case, we're going to be fixing them directly to a locked-in content or a hot zone. The first thing when implementing the widgets is to bring in the ASPX dock zone control. If we take a quick look at some of the properties here, we're nominating that it's horizontal, that the panels need to be spaced 10 pixels apart. The critical element really is making sure that you set the zone UID. It's going to be referenced by each of the individual widgets. We've also got a client instance name of dock zone. Now the widgets themselves will be implemented pretty much identically, with a slight change obviously of content. But here we've got the ASPX dock panel. We've got an ID of widget 2, and we've got this allow dock state. So this controls whether the widget can be dragged and dropped anywhere, or whether it's locked into just the areas we want. Again, the critical element is setting the owner zone UID. This has to match the relevant dock zone, otherwise your widget's just not going to appear. The drag element represents what area I can use to actually drag the element around. So we're saying you can use anywhere in the window. And we're actually turning the header control off. We're setting up the CSS class called widget, and we're giving it a client instance name of DPW2. So the content of the widget itself. We've got a couple of image controls. The first one is the close image. So if we think about how they get displayed, this little cross which looks like a close button, is actually an image on top of an image. So you get that really nice cool style. The second image is the main image for the actual control. We're going to repeat that process for the second and third panels. Underneath the widget content is that gallery control. That starts out by creating this new div. It has a class of index offers and the content column. First thing is to set the title and then implement the gallery. Now when it comes to implementing the slider, it is really simple. Drag in the ASPX image slider control and you can set some basic properties. You'll notice that we're turning encode HTML to false. This is so that we can use markup inside our text elements. Now the slider control has a lot of different ways of being used. So you've got multiple things for animation. You can nominate how you want your images to be treated, whether they're to be zoomed or scaled. In our case, we're using fill and crop. And whether the item text is to be visible all the time or only when the user puts their mouse over. We can also see that we're setting the slideshow to autoplay. Now in our case, when it came to populating the items, we went with a hard-coded approach. You could quite easily change this to set it inside your code to be dynamically loading these images from a folder that you might add or remove content from. But effectively, each of the image slider elements is pointing to a picture file, and then we're using some inline markup to specify the text. So you can see here that I'm adding a div called using the hotel class, passing in the title, and then using a class called city and passing the city name and then a class called price. This effectively gives us that really nice look over the top right hand side of the picture, which keeps it out of the way. It doesn't detract from the core image itself. So that's our heading section, our widget panel, and the gallery control implemented. All that's left for us to do is implement the pop-up control for the widgets. So again, we're seeing the ASPX pop-up control. This time inside the content, we're showing you that the widgets can be used to display dynamic content, and then giving you a close button which is hiding the widget view itself. So nothing spectacular. Another good example though of how to use some of those hidden and embedded controls. So that we can see all this come together, we need to add the user controls back into the master page, and then we'll be ready to actually look at this inside the browser. Once I'm on my master page, expand the Solution Explorer, find the user controls, and literally just drag them into place. So here I'm going to have my header control. Here I'm going to have my footer control. You'll notice that there's registration entries get added to the top of the page for those user controls. I'm going to do a build. Everything checks out, so let's look at it in the browser. We can see that I've got my landing page. Everything's looking really nice. I've got my header and my footer, my gallery control, the widget controls, my pop-up controls are all working. So that's great. And that's a great place to leave, ready for tomorrow's session where we're going to continue to build out DX hotels.